And welcome to the first of our 3 live streams this weekend, where we will be answering all your questions tonight and tomorrow night. And then on Sunday, I have a special live stream lecture planned for all of you, talking about, I don't know exactly which topic I'm going to talk about, but presidential terms, and a little bit about Black history and Black History Month, which is ending today, February 28th. And I just dropped a long form video about that. I have long form videos dropping every Monday and Friday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so check those out. And join us this weekend for all of our live streams. You've got today. For the next hour or so, I will be answering all your questions and inquiries regarding social studies, the humanities, and the like, all of that great stuff. And then I will be doing the same thing tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is our original OG live stream, which we started doing back in May of last year, or June of last year. We've been doing this for just over a year. We just celebrated our birthday last couple weekends. We've been doing some stuff around the channel so that you guys can thank you for a wonderful first year that we've had here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. And then on Sunday, we will have our live stream lecture as usual, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. For the first time in a few weeks, I'm finally able to do all 3 live streams. Won't have a problem or anything like that. So if you like history and social studies, then you're in the right place. Consider liking and subscribing if you haven't done so already. For those of you who have subscribed, welcome, Friendly Neighborhood Historians. Being a Friendly Neighborhood Historian is as easy as liking and subscribing and joining the growing legion that we have. We have over 6,600. So we've got like 6,600 subscribers, and we've got a really good army that we're growing, but it's a friendly neighborhood army of friendly neighborhood historians and all of that fun stuff. You're in the right place. If you like history and social studies, this is what we do here at the channel. We drop short form content every day and long form videos every Monday and Friday nights, so join us there. If you want to learn more and you want to read what I'm talking about rather than just hear me discuss it, consider joining the Substack. And if you want more exclusive content or early releases, join my Patreon, where I am dropping the content earlier so that you guys don't have to wait for those pesky release times here on YouTube. But yes, consider liking and subscribing here on YouTube. And maybe if you want to see more exclusive content, like my series on the First Ladies, join the Patreon and all that stuff. So for the next hour or so, though, tonight and then tomorrow evening as well at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I will be answering all your questions related to social studies, history, and the like. So if you like those topics, you're in the right place. And if you don't, maybe you're just chilling. I'm just glad you're here, and I enjoy everybody being here. And it's not, Nighthawk, it's not necessarily about religion. It's about whatever you would like to learn about and whatever you'd like to ask about. It's an Ask Me Anything. So you get to ask a historian anything you'd like to ask. And so that's what we do here. And for some reason, I'm not seeing my chat. Uh-oh. Okay, let me see. All right, finally fix the filter. So yeah, we don't necessarily talk about religion, but if somebody has a question related to social studies or history regarding a religious movement or idea, then of course we talk about it, because I'm a historian and I'm answering all the questions you guys got. So if you guys like history, then you're in the right place. So consider asking anything about that. And if you like the way I talk about history, and just consider subscribing. And if you want more exclusive inquiries and to contact me directly, you can email me at friendlyneighborhoodhistory1@gmail.com. And of course, there's also IG, X, and FB that my wonderful moderator M put in the chat. And yes, I talk about world history. I talk about any history you would like. That's what I do here. So yeah, world history is definitely a part of that. Ancient history, modern history, medieval history, European history, American history, and history of Asia and Africa. I talk about as much of this as I possibly can here on the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. So we've got Carlisle, who is a well-known attender at these live streams, who is asking, did Russia send troops to assist in the American Revolution? No, the Russians weren't really, didn't really care. And actually at that time, there was a segment of what would become American territory later on that belonged to the Russians, namely the Pacific Northwest, all the way down to Northern California. The Russians were exploring. And of course, the Russians had Russian America, which was the colony of Alaska, which they would eventually sell to the United States in 1867 for $8.2 million. And that was, of course, Seward's Folly, which was supposed to be a huge mistake until they found all of this lumber and all of this gold, and then liquid gold, the black gold, oil, in Alaska. And obviously, it's become the 49th state and is one of the most well-known American states. It's the largest state by land in the United States. So as far as I know, Carlisle, the Russians were not involved in the American Revolution, at least not directly. Hello, welcome, thank you for joining us. So if you guys have a question you'd like to ask regarding history or social studies, please drop it in the chat and I will answer it as soon as I'm able to. And we'll keep this going. Some good vibes here on this Friday night. And yeah, we're going till 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or so. So yeah. We care. The Friendly Neighborhood Historians care, Miami. But I'm glad you're here anyways. Do you have a question about social studies or history? Because I care to answer your questions. AI, favorite president. Favorite isn't always the same. Yeah, AI Shadow, favorite president. Gee, there's a lot of presidents I really like. I'll talk about my favorite underrated presidents who people don't know about. And I'm a historian, so Miami, that means I'm actually qualified to talk about history, unlike people who just get on YouTube and try to spout ideas. So I've got a few presidents that I think are definitely underrated. McKinley, Monroe, Polk, got a lot accomplished in their terms and all of that great stuff. I wouldn't consider William Howard Taft to be an underrated president. He's not one of my favorite presidents. There's some really interesting information about him available. So yeah. So I like when people ask me my favorite presidents, I usually refer to presidents that I think are really underrated in American history and really had a really good impact, despite the fact that a lot of people don't know who they are. So anyways, I don't like the lighting. Let me fix that. Okay, that's a little bit better. So yeah, so AI, those are some of my favorite presidents. Nighthawk, how will end Ukrainian war given your knowledge? It looks like it's getting kind of tense. Volodymyr Zelensky's been visiting the White House and he was kicked out of the White House earlier, or he left in anger. It was raised voices with him, the president and the vice president of the United States. So there's a lot of tension between the Ukrainians and the United States right now. And a lot of people think that Trump is on Putin's side and on the Russian side. It just seems like the war is going to come to an end with probably a ceasefire within this year, where the Ukrainians have to give up a significant amount of their territory and are forced to sign a mineral treaty with the United States to pay back for all of the money that the U.S. gave to them during the conflict. So, yeah. AI Shadow saying minus TR. Well, that's not a bad president at all. He's really enjoyable. I mean, I've learned so much about Teddy Roosevelt. There's so many fascinating things about him, like for the fact that he hated being called Teddy. He preferred TR or Theodore or Mr. President or President Roosevelt. He never liked being called Teddy. Teddy was the nickname given to him associated with a bear that he refused to shoot. And because he refused to shoot it, a toy maker turned that into the teddy bear. And it became the most popular toy in the country. Is it true that Taft had the bathroom redone to his needs? Yeah, Carlisle, I actually did so I do historical myth videos on this channel all the time, and one of the biggest historical myths that I uncovered was the historical myth of William Howard Taft in the bath. So according to legend, William Howard Taft was so overweight and gained 100 pounds during his presidency alone because he was so unhappy being president that he actually got stuck in a White House bathtub and had to be lifted out with a Hoyer lift, and then they had to reinstall a bigger tub that was basically the size of a small swimming pool for the president's corpulent needs. Not true at all. He did get stuck, and he would get unstuck with the help of a White House aide named Ike Hoover, who worked in the White House for like 7 presidents for like 45 years. But Taft never had to be lifted out by a lift or a dolly or a Hoyer lift or a forklift, and they never did change the bathroom because of his needs. Taft was extremely unhappy with becoming president and found it to be a very difficult job. He didn't want to be president. He wanted to be the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He is actually the reason that the U.S. Supreme Court got its own building and no longer meets in the Senate, in the halls of the Senate like it did before he became Chief Justice after his presidency in 1921. Taft also, interestingly enough, liked to do his business in the White House in an Oval Room, which obviously has become the office of a modern president. And Taft, when he would go to baseball games, would stand up and stretch during the 7th inning. And everybody, as a sign of respect to the U.S. president, would get up and stretch too. So the 7th inning stretch actually comes from a U.S. president, believe it or not. How American of that. Yeah, so AI Shadow TR is definitely not a hard president, not a bad president to enjoy and really respect and like. I obviously have a very high opinion of Teddy Roosevelt. Obviously had some bad views, some very regressive views, especially about Native Americans that are really, really difficult to reconcile with all the great things he did. But obviously a very bold and aggressive president who got a lot done during his presidency. So obviously an interesting guy who kind of changed America because of his activity. Ryan, hello, I'm watching Jordan Peele's U.S. movie, a major use of symbolism in Hands Across America, being Canadian. I didn't know that was a real event. What was it again? AIDS research. Yeah, Hands Across America, if I'm correct, was a campaign in the 1990s to bring awareness to AIDS. I think that might be where the AIDS quilt was associated with. I don't know 100% about it, but yeah. Best question of Churchill. Well, I have an entire video and an entire live stream lecture. So I do live stream lectures every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern, Nighthawk, where I actually discuss the impact and legacy of Winston Churchill and how he changed Great Britain and obviously impacted the world and helped bring about the end of World War II, and who he was and what his background was. So Churchill's a fascinating guy. I think that the thing we don't pay attention to enough about Churchill is his foresight when it comes to the Soviet Union. He was the only British politician after World War I, or should I say World War II, because I believe that there are 3 world wars, not two. He's the only British politician after the Great War in 1918 who believed that the Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, should continue to send forces to stop the Bolshevik Revolution, because he believed that the budding Soviet Union was extraordinarily dangerous, and he held this view ongoing. And then after World War II, he reiterated these ideas when he visited the United States. So Churchill had an incredible ability to predict what was going to happen next in history. He knew the dangers of the Nazis early on in the 1930s, and he knew the dangers of the Soviet Union and of communism in Russia in the 1910s, and again after World War III in the 1940s. Yeah. So Taft did end up losing weight. He lost I think 100 more pounds after the presidency, and he went back and joined the Supreme Court. He's the only U.S. president to sign in another president when he gave the oath of office to President Calvin Coolidge in 1925. Just such a fascinating guy. Ryan, also this movie features, I think, an all-black or majority-black cast, so that's appropriate for Black History Month, besides Jordan Peele being a successful black storyteller and director. Yep, definitely the case. Really fascinating guy, really talented. And at the end of the day, it is true that we are at the end of Black History Month. So after you're done watching the live stream, I've got a video on Black History Month that debuted at 8 p.m. Eastern. So go and check that out and watch that, where I talk about the history of Black History Month and why it became such a significant celebration for Americans throughout our society, in education and government, in places like that. And basically was a way to preserve black culture, the fear of it being shut down by white supremacy and the lost cause myth and segregationists who wanted to erase black history. Black History Month, created by Carter G. Woodson, was a way to rebel against that and to allow blacks to be able to tell their story through their history. There's an argument amongst historians and obviously politically and culturally about whether there should be a Black History Month or not, because a lot of people feel that it's kind of redundant, that Black history should be celebrated at all times. And I definitely think that, but the same way somebody who is Christian might want to celebrate Jesus's birth every day of the year, but Christmas especially, African Americans may very well want to celebrate their history and their impact on America, not just every month, but in February especially. So there's that too. What do I think about UK Nova Days? I think it's a way weaker than in older days. Very mixed up, confused. Like, I don't know what you mean by UK Nova Days, so you're gonna have to explain that a little bit more, Nighthawk. But yeah, Ryan is a longtime friendly neighborhood historian. So is Gaia Han, and it's so great to see both of you joining us. And Gaia Han, I hope I'm pronouncing your username correctly. I try my absolute best. These guys come to the live streams, they ask great questions, and they do, and they are really, really helpful. Nighthawk, what about the UK in current times? Thoughts on the Apollo moon landings? Well, the Apollo moon landings are obviously a series of landings. Apollo was the mission of NASA to get to the moon, which was a promise given by John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s, which the Americans, surprisingly to the whole world, were able to accomplish by the end of the decade. He said, by the end of the 1960s, we'll have a man on the moon. And by the end of the 1960s, the Americans got a man on the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. They eventually stopped them because it kind of became superfluous to just keep sending men time and time again to the moon. There never was an issue or a question of the ability to settle the moon. That really didn't enter into the equation. So the Americans were much more interested in just proving to the Soviets that they could land on the moon and land there repeatedly and safely. And there's obviously a lot of conspiracy theories about the staging of the moon landing and stuff like that it was done on a soundstage. And there's really no evidence for that at all. And I've listened to this conspiracy theory and read about it before, and it's obvious that they actually were able to get up into space. An incredible accomplishment, part of the space race, which is part of the Cold War. The only reason the Americans went to the moon was to prove that the Soviet Union couldn't do it. In 1957, the Soviets sent the first satellite into orbit, Sputnik. The next year, they sent 59. They sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space ahead of the Americans. So the Americans had to play catch up really fast. So President Eisenhower created the National Aeronautics Space Administration, NASA, in 1958, and NASA worked tirelessly to catch up with the Soviets. And in 1961, they sent the first American, Alan Shepard, into the moon. A year later, to a space, and then a year later, they sent the first man to orbit the Earth, which hadn't happened before. The Soviets hadn't done this. This was John Glenn. And then to prove that they could really hammer the Soviets, they sent the first team to the moon with Apollo 11 in 1969. They had problems. Apollo 13, Apollo 7, there were difficulties with some of the moon landing operations. And eventually they became much more interested in excavating and exploring deeper space and other planets like Mars. So that gave way to Viking and some of the other projects that NASA would undergo. And now it seems like SpaceX is kind of taking the reins away from the American government with that. Werner von Braun went from the tiny Mercury redstone rock to the giant Saturn V in just 8 years. Insane. Can't wait to go back to the moon with Artemis and SpaceX. Yeah. Well, what's really cool about it all, Gaiahan, is that Werner von Braun had developed the V2 rocket for the Nazis, or had developed rockets for the Nazis, and then gave us the V2 rocket, and also worked on the space program. And there were many Nazis in what's called Operation Paperclip that were brought to the United States beginning in the Cold War, and who worked with immunity with the United States government to produce the space program and other military technology for the US against the Soviets, and never had to pay up for the crimes they did against humanity during the Soviet Union, during the Holocaust and World War III. So, yep, that sounds right for Bart Simpson. LOL. Who doesn't like Bart Simpson? There are so many great space jokes in The Simpsons. Let me see. Sebair, great to see you. Sorry I missed some of your shows. I felt sick several times due to getting hit from directed energy weapons. Me and my family. Question, is the deep state preventing FBI from releasing Epstein list? Yes, so that's a big news today, and I actually made a quick video yesterday and then deleted it because JK, they were supposed to release the Jeffrey Epstein files. Jeffrey Epstein was a New York financier who apparently worked in exploiting children and things like that, and had an island where celebrities and high-ranking people in the culture and politics and government would go and visit and perhaps partake in these exploits, and he ran it along with his partner, Ghislaine Maxwell. Epstein died in prison in 2019 and didn't kill himself, obviously. And so Ghislaine Maxwell is now facing criminal prosecution, and there's been this question of files gathered by the DOJ in their investigation surrounding Epstein and what's actually happening. And a lot of people want these files to be made public knowledge, and the Trump administration promises that it will do this. However, supposedly, resistance from the FBI headquarters in New York is keeping Kash Patel, the new head of the FBI, from giving it to Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, who will then release it to the public. Obviously, the victims their names will be redacted and held back, but the question is, who were some of the perpetrators who participated in these activities with Epstein, paid Epstein for these services, and went to his island. So there's a lot of questions about who these people are and what they did and how deep this actually goes. And a lot of people feel that it will expose a conspiracy within the government to exploit a hedonistic plot within the government to expose those who are manipulating and abusing people, particularly children. So there's a lot of really scary things about that. But Sabera, I'm really sorry about the energy weapons. I hope you and your family are okay and safe. And and there's been a lot of people coming onto this channel talking about energy weapons and their interesting proliferation. So those are like the newest, most effective and deadliest form of killing. Like UK after Brexit seems to be weaker than before and definitely not more independent. Yeah, Nighthawk, it's interesting. The big issue with Britain right now is, yes, it's out of the EU, but it still has the effects of the EU from before it got out of the EU. And so they are now they deal with less economic opportunities because they're not part of the European Union. They've kind of pulled out of the common market too. And the pound is the dollar again there. And they also have an influx of immigrants, and there's a lot of tension between native Brits and these immigrant populations, many of them from the Middle East, who have settled in refugee sectors that are completely segregated from the rest of British society. So there's a lot of questions about Britain's future, and it doesn't look very positive for a lot of people. D. Reyes, have you ever had a boyfriend? No. I can clearly say never had a boyfriend. Next question. Thomas, what's up? Well, the ceiling for one, but also not too much. And Simon is not here. We haven't had Simon in a while, but obviously we miss him and wish him well, and hope he is checking out the live streams ex post facto and really enjoying the content here on the channel, the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, where we bring you history in a friendly neighborhood manner. And if you like history, you are in the right place. I want to welcome you all and hope you are enjoying your Friday night. Please consider liking and subscribing and asking a question, posting a topic or a comment in the chat you want me to go over something related to social studies or history. So I don't know much about Jimmy Savile, but the name does sound familiar. Interesting. Ryan is saying, as a refinery chemical worker, I have heard news in Canada. We are potentially going to sell our oil and gas byproduct to Japan, among other EU countries. Well, they need it. And Germany definitely needs those things right now. So a lot of these countries are relying on imports from countries that are still producing a large amount of natural gas and things like that. So, and yes, Ryan is absolutely spitting. Great guy. Really appreciate him. And I'm pinning that quote. Like and subscribe, become a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as that, folks. Do you think a situation will improve, or what was the nail in the coffin and they got going kind of down? I don't know. I think you're referring to the situation we're talking about with Great Britain and the UK. I think that the West is in such a deep political tension that it might lead to some period of decline. There seems to be a lot of political reformation in Great Britain that needs to happen before there's a cohesive message from the British population. There's a lot of divisions, and political polarization and isolation does not make it easier for a country to operate in a modern international world. And so I understand that the struggles that the British are going through right now. So, but yeah, Nighthawk, you're asking some really great questions, and I'm really, really glad that you're here. Interesting, yeah. Speaking of Brits, Prince Andrew, who has gotten in a lot of trouble with a lot of people wondering about his affiliations, was apparently on Epstein's flight list. Tom Hanks, Bill Clinton have been named among it. A lot of people wonder about President Trump and his connection to Jeffrey Epstein. They were friends. They did work together in New York a while back. And if Trump ever went to the island, or what kind of dealings he had with Jeffrey Epstein back in the day, there's a lot of really deep questions there that could expose the political upper class that a lot of people feel is seedy and completely debauched and violent. So trying to diversify our foreign trade so it's not focused on the USA. In all honesty, we should have done this years ago. Don't keep all your eggs in one basket. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, especially if the US is not going to engage in free trade, that the Canadians would want to engage in trade with other countries in different ways, shapes, and forms. So yeah, Ryan, it makes sense. You. Do what you got to do up there in Canada. So. And we get people in this channel all the time who come from Canada. We get people from India and from Finland and from Iraq and Russia. It's really, really awesome to see all the diversity and all of the people from all over the world who join and who like and subscribe. And then I see them in channel commenting on videos and watching stuff like my video on Black History Month, which just debuted. We've got a really great and wonderful channel here with so many great people. And I'm always very grateful for all the conversations we have. And we've got a smaller crowd like we do tonight. It's always carried by good bandying about and deep, sophisticated answers to questions. So if I notice it's a larger crowd, what I'll tend to do is I'll tend to answer them more at a shotgun, trying to give the best answer I possibly can in a few seconds. And if it's a smaller crowd, I get to go into a lot more detail talking about things. I don't know a huge amount about Jimmy Savile. I'm just hearing about him for kind of the first time. And so because of that, I can't answer as much, but I'm doing the best I can. Also happy to say we are talking about northern sovereignty more serious up in the Arctic. As someone who has worked and lived in Nunavut, we need soldiers there. Yeah, that's definitely something. And the U.S. wants sovereignty there. It wants its own sovereignty by owning Greenland. So there's something that's going on. What was Diogenes of Sinope's most badass moment, according to Richard Earle? I believe it was his encounter with Alexander the Great you were mentioning before. You might want to put it in the chat. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I used to live in the UK but left. It's just not the same, and a lot of conflict between native citizens and immigrants, and there's a lot of them. UK is lost. Yeah, there's this feeling that amongst a lot of people in European countries that isn't the same in the United States. So the United States has a much more prevalent track record of immigration and naturalization and assimilation, and it has led to a lot of problems and conflict in American history and continues to lead to political discussions and diatribes and division. But the truth of the matter is that the British that many European countries, for all their wonderful things, don't have as much of a track record of immigration. And those countries are based more on the sovereignty of the individual, in the sense of, what does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be German? There's a specific ethnic history that dates back to the creation of these states, based on a particular tribe or group of ethnos of people that have lived and settled in that area, be they British or French or Spanish or Russian. And because of that, being part of that country means being that. In the United States, there's less of an established track record because you have an amalgamation of different immigrant groups who have settled in the country at different periods of time and who have made their own stamp and contributed to the narrative. So an American could be Italian, they could be African American, they could be Hispanic, they could be Asian. And they're just as American as somebody who was an Angloid white person. So because there's an immigration and settler narrative that helped create and forge the United States, it's not so much that it's based on being an American, because an American can have any sort of ethnic background. That's not the case in Europe. It's not necessarily the case in Africa or South America. There's definitely a difference there. So, and Nighthawk, that's a big so immigration, refugees, things like that are a big issue in Europe, and they are an issue in the United States, because there's this growing understanding of how do you diversify a country that has had an established understanding of its own people for over 1,000 years, like Britain or France. So, Ryan, Greenland is beautiful. I've always wanted to visit Nuuk, their capital. Yeah, it is an extremely beautiful country. And they actually named it ironically because it's far more frigid than Iceland is. So the Iceland is green and Greenland is icy. But obviously settled by the Norwegians and later given to the Danes. During World War II, the United States occupied, or should I say World War III, the United States occupied that island and wanted to buy it after World War III because they thought they could stop the Soviets in the Arctic Circle. Trump also wants to buy Greenland for the same reasons. He's worried about Russian activity and hegemony over operations and trade in the Arctic Circle. So there's stuff like that going on. Did you see the argument between Trump and Zelensky today at the White House? It was really heated. Yeah, we're not used to seeing that in American history, where a president and a foreign president have almost come to blows and one leaves or is kicked out in anger and disgrace and things stall. We hear about these things happening behind the scenes, but in front of cameras and reporters, it's just not common. And that's just the Trump factor. Trump says what he wants and expresses exactly how he feels, and he doesn't care who's watching or who's there. He's just going to say what he wants. Nationalism is definitely having a resurgence. The heavy use of being near 24/7 connected to a global world has definitely worn down national identity in some countries. Yes, and whenever you see something that is part of something for long enough, a cultural feature start to wear down, there's a resistance to that, typically from more conservative elements of society. So conservatives in the West see that a breakdown of the idea of national identity, so they cling to national identity, and there's a resurgence because they get louder and louder and more passionate about that. This is why you have people like Tucker Carlson, Tommy Robinson, and Donald Trump, obviously is an example of this, who are preaching national identity and isolationism because they feel that multiculturalism and these things threaten the true shape of their national identity, even as those things start to erode anyways, they're going to stand in direct opposition to it. Richard Earle, Diogenes of Sinope was visited by Alexander the Great once because of his fame. He asked Diogenes whatever he wanted he could have had, and he said, "Get out of the sun." Oh yes, wasn't that the guy who laughed to death because of a joke? He was a philosopher. Should countries, Nighthawk is asking, should countries be held accountable for past genocides? Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, I think that countries that refuse to acknowledge past genocides should definitely acknowledge them and stand responsible for them. And the great example of this is the Turks. I think that countries are very good at accepting their responsibility. The Chinese Communist Party needs to accept responsibility for how now killed 40 million people. So the Russians should realize, and Putin should really realize, that Joseph Stalin was not a great person. He did a lot of damage to his own people, and killing 20 million of them during his regime over the Soviet Union. The idea that you have to to make an omelet, you have to crack a few eggs, didn't turn out to be true at all, because the Soviet Union was not a paradise-like idyllic omelet. It was more of a disaster with a bunch of broken eggs in it. So I don't think countries should necessarily be held accountable for those things, but I think countries should acknowledge their past and realize this wasn't a good idea so that they can move forward. Because it is true, although I hate historical cliches, Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Whoa, happy Friday to you, TGIF, and thank you for joining us at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel to start off your weekend the right way before you go party and have some fun tonight. Come and ask historical questions, talk about different historical topics and all of that great stuff. And then join us tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for round 2, where I'll be answering even more questions and topics related to history and social studies. And then Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I have got a live stream lecture about presidential terms, why there are 4 years, why there are only 2 of them, and all of that good stuff as people look at the second term of Donald Trump. And I will also discuss Trump's insistence on getting a 3rd term and where that's actually coming from. So please join us then. And if you're enjoying what I'm talking about right now, like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. Em, if you're here, my wonderful moderator, Em, is doing such a great job. Can you put the social media links in the chat? Ryan is saying, I think the Trump presidency, if not more positively or negatively, but definitely will be remembered as a president who broke many American political firsts. Trudeau will be seen similar in Canada. Yeah, but they'll be seen similarly for completely different reasons, because they're completely different men. I think Trudeau is very progressive and open-minded. I think Trump's extremely bullish and brutish, and he's not the only president to act like this. Teddy Roosevelt and Andrew Jackson were both very aggressive men who wanted their way, and Richard Nixon had that along with Trump's long history of corruption charges and stuff like that. So Nixon, Roosevelt, and Jackson have been presidents that Trump is and should be compared to. And to say he's a first is true, but to say we've never seen anything like this before is an exaggeration made by people who usually hate him, who want to make him look bad. And I don't think that's fair. Nighthawk, have you heard of the Volhynia massacre? I have. Jogged my memory about it. That sounds like something from the Soviet Union. What is the history of the days of the week? Well, I know that Odin's Day became Wednesday, Thor's Day became Thursday. The calendar and the way it's set up is based on the ancient Romans, and they created the Julian calendar, and then the Catholic Church updated that with the Gregorian calendar under Pope Gregory. I don't remember which pope it was. And so the old style, as we call it, is the Julian calendar, which is about 2 weeks behind the normal style, which is why in Russia they celebrate Christmas 2 weeks after we do in the West. But so the Gregorian calendar is the NS, the new style, versus the old style, the Julian calendar. And the days of the week, many of them are inspired by Norse gods, because the English language is inspired by Germanic languages and by Latin and French. But there's a huge populace of Vikings, starting with the Anglo-Saxons, who invade and settle Roman England starting in the 5th century AD. And that continual harassment and invasion of Britain by Viking groups from Northern Europe and Scandinavia continues until the 11th century. So there's a huge amount of the English language and culture that is influenced by Vikings, Vikingers, raiders from Nordic countries like Denmark and Scandinavia. In fact, they once divided up England in what's called the Danelaw in the early 9th century AD, and then in the early 1000s, the Norwegians actually conquered England and absorbed it into their empire, the North Sea Empire, for about 30 years. So that is why the days of the week have names based in Norse mythology, at least a few of them. I don't know why Sunday is Sunday or Saturday, but I do know Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Freya is the sister of Thor. She's the goddess of the hunt. Freya is Freya Day. So that's where we get all of that from. Ryan, any updates on being able to read your dissertation? Yes, I just need to redact some personal information there. So I have my master's, it's my master's thesis. It's on the Great Game, which is Russia and Great Britain's competition over Afghanistan and South Asia during the 19th century. So I've got that ready to go. I just need to edit it and redact a few things, and then I can put it on Substack as a document and just have you guys read it anytime you want. And Ryan's also asking, the 7 Years' War is the First World War, according to me, because in my opinion, during the 1750s and 60s, Germany, the Prussians, went to war with the world. Prussia and Great Britain fought against France, Russia, and Austria. And this included fighting off the coasts of Africa, in North America, the French Indian War, as it was called over here, and in India between the British and the French and their Indian allies. So you had colonial peoples involved, you had native peoples involved, you had multiple continents involved. You didn't have Latin America and East Asia as much, but you did have involvements all around the world and different European empires trying to gain more land and influence. And guess what? They did. Prussia and Great Britain were able to win that war Britain gained Canada from this, started taxing its colonies. France went bankrupt, eventually leading to its own revolution. The taxing of the British colonies led to the American Revolution, and the Russians were so frustrated that their czar pulled them out of the war that he got assassinated by his wife, who became Catherine the Great, Russia's greatest ruler, perhaps. So the world system changed phenomenally because of this war, just like in the other two world wars. So that's from 1756 to 1763, and for me, that's World War I. World War II is what we call the Great War, 1914 to 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm II and Franz Joseph fighting against the Russians, the French, the British, and later the Americans. And of course, the Third World War is the one in the 1930s and 40s with the Nazi Germans and the Japanese. It's one of my more unique historical perspectives that I've actually defended on a live stream lecture, and we'll probably make a long form video explaining exactly why I feel that way in the near future. One other thing is interesting. Speaking of world wars and interesting perspectives, I believe that the Third World War does not start when the Nazis invade Poland or at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attack the Americans in 1941. I believe it happens in 1937 when the Chinese are invaded by the Japanese at the Battle of the Marco Polo Bridge, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and because of that, Japan is going to attack China, and that's going to bring Japan into conflict with the rest of Asia and Great Britain and later the Americans. So that's when I think World War III actually happens. And some would say it starts as early as 35 when Mussolini invades Ethiopia, and others say it starts as early as 31 when the Japanese seize Manchuria, already getting involved in Asia. AI Shadow, what's the most interesting fact about James Madison you can think of? So James Madison smoked a cigar a day and drank a pint of whiskey, and he was a lot shorter than his own wife, and he was 17 years older than her. So there's some interesting stuff. James Madison was kind of like this brainy, nerdy, dorky president, the fourth president of the United States. He wrote the American Constitution, and he was just kind of reserved to himself, and his wife Dolly loved to hold parties and give everybody oyster ice cream because that was in vogue at the time. So yeah, interesting stuff. What's the history of South Korea? Well, South Korea's history isn't that long compared to the Korean Peninsula itself, but the entire Korean Peninsula has kind of throughout the medieval and early modern period played China and Japan off of each other to do what it can to have its own independence. The Mongols conquered it under Kublai Khan in the 1270s, and then it gained its independence. And during the medieval period, there was an autonomous Korean kingdom there known as the Koryo Kingdom, and that is where Korea gets its name, Koryo. So the Koreans have a huge influence from the Japanese and Chinese ethnically and culturally, although the Japanese did not conquer Korea until the early 1900s. So were you able to do research on the Hannibal Protocol? I haven't done research on it, but Sebair, I'm taking your word for it because you know a lot about this stuff, and I'm not surprised because I've heard about security breaches and I've heard about them not wanting people to be kidnapped. I mean, obviously, I think that killing anyone at any period is an obviously horrible thing, something that the IDF has done on many occasions. But at the same time, you also have to, the Gazans have completely manipulated, the Palestinians and Hamas have completely manipulated this war as a PR campaign. The goal of this war, it's clear in retrospect, between Gaza and the Israelis, wasn't for the Palestinians under Hamas control to win and destroy Israel. It was for the international community to turn on Israel, and it sure has in huge numbers because you've got 40,000 Gazans who have died, unfortunately, in this war. It's a horrible, horrible thing. Gaza has been leveled, and now the United States wants to go in. But the truth of the matter is, the point of this war, in retrospect, was for Hamas to terrorize the Israelis, get a huge retaliation, and then make themselves look like the victims. And when you read about the Beavis family and you read about how the BBC is apologizing now because basically they made a documentary about this war where they were misled and corrupted, when you read about the fact that Hamas set up its military headquarters in the cellars and basements of hospitals so that the Israelis would bomb hospitals so that they would look bad, it's obvious the war was made to make the international community turn on Israel and hate Israel. And that has happened in droves, especially among younger generations. At the same time, any policy relegated by the IDF that has them killing people who would otherwise be taken hostage is absolutely abominable. So, and you've got security leaks. It was just a disaster that day. Ryan Waku is saying, American Revolution 1776, and then Canada politely waited officially until 1982 to legally become independent of the British Parliament via the Canadian Act. And isn't that just how Americans versus Canadians are in their big brother, little brother, North Atlantic relationship? The Canadians are polite, more reserved, and the Americans are more feisty and aggressive. Although Canada did have its own electoral process, it had its own government, it had its own prime ministers in the 1840s. So. Texas Repo, Madison drank a pint of whiskey every day, much respect. Yeah, I don't know if I could do that much and still be alive. But if you're enjoying the stream, please like and subscribe. Listen to Ryan, he's a great guy. And Friday and Saturday, I answer all of your questions related to history, and then Sundays, I give a live stream lecture. What's the history of propaganda? As long as this, and I was just explaining that actually, so I've actually been able to give you a little bit of an answer in a case study using the Gazans, or at least Hamas is an example of that. The truth of the matter is that propaganda is part of the human experience, because propaganda is a two-pronged attack by a country against their enemy in the warfare of communication. And it really becomes popular in the modern world because all of the technology used to create weapons of mass destruction, be they heavy artillery, machine guns, submarines, or of course nuclear weapons, also are used to create technology to reach out to their people. So you've got radio broadcasts, you've got propaganda posters where demonize the enemy on one end and also glorify your side. So you dehumanize your enemies, making them look like animals, basically, so that your people will turn against them and fear them. And there's propaganda from both sides that did this in the later two world wars of the 20th century. And it also includes radio broadcasts, movies, cartoons. Walt Disney did cartoons for the government that were basically propaganda pieces that completely dehumanized the enemy. Radio broadcasts during most of the modern wars have one side taunting the soldiers of the other side and mocking them and running them down and begging them to surrender. It's really, really powerful. So propaganda is the ability to use communication and the tools therein to decimate your opponents and destroy them. And to also glorify your own land, even if you have to lie about it. It's a form of imperialism and jingoism mixed with brutality. So, Richard Earl, how many people try to drink like Winston Churchill so far? I don't know, but I'm sure most of them are dead. Richard, there is a fun video of two guys who do alcohol reviews on YouTube that try to match Churchill drink for drink. Whiskey Tribe, this channel. I'll have to look that out, check that out, because that's fun. It sounds like a lot of fun. AI Shadow, if you had to go back into the past, into a different historical area, what would it be? For me personally, it would be the first 20 years of the 20th century. Yeah, well, you've got World War II interrupting that, the Great War, the war to end all wars, but there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. For me, I would love to go back to the late 19th century, before then, when you've got a lot of peace and prosperity, especially in Western Europe, and you've got you've got all of these new amazing inventions, like moving pictures by Thomas Edison. You've got phonographs, you've got electric lights, you've got some level of modern technology mixed with something that's still pretty traditional and historic. And you've got an era where it's not too modern, but you still have a decent amount of technology and things like that. So AI, if I were to go back, I'd go back to the late 19th century, probably in Western Europe. Paris, I mean, you've got the Salon, you've got the Can-Can, you've got all of these incredible artists like Monet, Manet, and Renoir, showing all their great work. It would just be an amazing time to be alive. And I love the history of art, so that's obviously part of it too. Yep, and Ryan, you definitely see that with the remake of Nosferatu. It's definitely in vogue to go back to those early 20th century pictures. I mean, the film, about going to the moon, that was like 20 minutes long. People felt that the world was only going to get better and better, and then war came. Yep. Human beings like to be scared, they like to be afraid, and they would rather be afraid. And Ryan, the truth of the matter is, we would rather be afraid of things from the outside than from our own exterior problems that we have as humans. And the scariest thing you'll ever run into is another human being sometimes. So, but not here at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, because hopefully I'm not too scary, and hopefully there's nothing else scary going on for you right now, and you're just enjoying the live stream. And if you really like history, you're in the right place. Consider liking and subscribing, all of that good stuff. Woa is asking, what's the history of Vanguard? What do you mean Vanguard? You mean the company Vanguard, the financial company? I wouldn't know. A Vanguard means a troop that will support and keep people safe, usually. That's what a Vanguard is. So, I don't know if Emma is still here, but if you could put the social media handles in the chat, they're at the very top of the chat right now. If you want to follow me on X or IG or Facebook, I've got a Patreon where you can see bonus content and early releases, such as my series on the First Ladies. And if you don't like the sound of my voice, but you like the way I talk about history, consider reading my articles on Substack. So there's a lot of fun places you can go to get more friendly neighborhood history content. Yeah, I don't know the history of the company too much. I believe they've just emerged as one of these financial wizards in the last few decades that capitalize on on the growing economic, on the efforts of the middle class and upper middle class to preserve their wealth and invest it properly, and have become probably the default or one of the main financial institutions and intermediaries in the country. Hopefully that smoking jacket doesn't become sentient and attack you in a Twilight Zone. Yeah, I'm okay. That won't happen. There is that too, Ryan. There is a game. Indeed, there is. So, anyways, we're at 45 minutes. Let's see if we get any more questions. If not, if everybody's good and I've answered all the historical inquiries possible, which I don't think I have, then we'll stop a few minutes early and everybody can go about their Friday evenings. We'll be back again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But does anyone have questions regarding history or social studies? Because I'm here to answer them. Sabir, yes. What do you think of Alfred Pike's statement about predictions of 3 world wars? Which 2 happened as his predictions before? I don't know what that would be. I don't know who Alfred Pike is. AI Shadow, I enjoy the Gilded Age progressive era. It features some interesting events. Yes, it does. There's definitely this change, and there's all sorts of achievements and accomplishments of that progressive era. You get women getting the right to vote. You get workers' rights. You get unionization. You get collective bargaining. The late 19th and early 20th century sees a huge, the women's movement, the workers' movement, all kind of uniting together to get better rights and clean, sanitary working stations, living wages. You have a specialization of labor thanks to the assembly line, which makes labor much more valuable and allows people to make a lot more money. Yeah. And I'm glad you were able to catch it, Ryan, because it's always great to have you here. Whoa, what's the history of Henry Hoover? I don't know. Do you mean Herbert Hoover, the U.S. president? Is there any movies coming out in 2025 you are interested in? I mean, I just saw the Captain America movie, and it was subpar because Marvel doesn't know how to make movies anymore, and they're just cashing in on all of the retinue and shock value they can, and the star power of someone like Harrison Ford. I really want to see the new movie that just came out, Riff Raff. That looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. I don't know of any historical films, but if they come out, but there's always a couple that come out that I get really, really interested in. So we'll see. Riff Raff is right now on my list, and I want to go see that probably pretty soon. Bill Murray, Pete Davidson, looks really interesting. Oh, Herbert Hoover. So yeah, whoa, Herbert Hoover is the 31st president of the United States and probably the most hated president in American history because he didn't do enough to stop the Great Depression. He didn't get the government involved enough to stem the tide and stop the bleeding that was happening with the United States and its economics at the time and its society. But it's interesting, despite all of the failures he had as president, Herbert Hoover was an extremely accomplished man. He was a miner who went to Australia and made a fortune. He just had this ability to figure out where gold mines were and where veins were, and he brought in the literal mother lode. By the way, that term, mother lode, is not it's not mother and L-O-A-D, it's mother and L-O-D-E, because a lode was a huge rake in from mining. So whenever you got a huge amount of copper or gold or silver or whatever material you were mining for, you would bring in the mother lode, L-O-D-E. So the lode is how much you brought in from a vein, from a mining vein. And so Herbert Hoover was incredibly good at striking the mother lode at different Australian gold mines. And he made his own wealth and he became extraordinarily rich. So much so that during the 1910s, President Wilson asked him at the end of World War I, or World War II as I call it, to organize relief efforts because he was so good at organization and planning. And he actually did. And first he paid attention to Belgium, which had been oppressed by the Germans throughout the war. Then he took his attention to Russia, where there was starving because of the Civil War, because of the Bolshevik Revolution, which I talked about, referencing Churchill's hatred of communism. And Hoover actually raised tons of private funds throughout the United States and was able to save millions of people who were starving in Europe. So he's actually probably saved more lives than any U.S. president. Then he goes on to serve as the Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, and he warns Coolidge about people loaning too much money, borrowing too much money, and all of these things. And then he becomes president, and the economy crashes, and he's not inspiring enough. He doesn't show enough interest. He seems really detached, and because he's not proactive enough, the American economy suffers, and Hoover gets a horrible reputation. He really isn't responsible for it. He just doesn't know how to solve it, and so he gets his butt whooped in 1932 when he runs for re-election against Franklin Roosevelt, who does promise to do something and then does a lot to try to fix the Great Depression. Hoover will spend the next 30 years of his life writing and complaining about how horrible his life is, but working at Stanford University, he founds the Hoover Institution, which is a well-known conservative think tank for the right. So Hoover is an interesting guy who probably was better skilled at not being president, but got a lot accomplished during his life outside of the presidency. It was just his presidency happened to coincide with the Great Depression. You can't blame him for that, but you can blame him for basically bungling fixing it. And by the way, he loved building new projects and constructions, and one of his most favorite building projects that he commissioned before the Great Depression would be finished in the late 1930s, and he would never get credit for it, but it is named after him, and that is, of course, Hoover Dam. So a lot of interesting stuff about Hoover there. Any knowledge about witches and Inquisition? So Nighthawk, the truth of the matter is, throughout most of European late medieval and early modern history, the destruction of witches and Inquisition trials did not kill millions of people like people like to say. The numbers are usually overblown. There were wars and all sorts of political strife because witchcraft and things like that and apostasy and practicing other religions were religious crimes. These people were usually tried in front of religious courts rather than regular law courts. And so the church actually took upon itself the process of inquiring, and that's where we get Inquisition from, into the spiritual status of all of these people who had apparently been heretics or practicing witchcraft. And so thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people were killed throughout the centuries during the Spanish Inquisition, which is the most infamous part because in Spain, there were a lot of people who had renounced the Catholic faith because they were Jewish, but they were baptized when they were babies, and the church did not respect that. They considered them to be Catholics, so they retroactively punished them for growing up Jews, even though they had been baptized as Catholics. So there were a lot of forced conversions, there was a lot of torture, and there was a lot of repudiation of what people believed to be heretical doctrines. And fear of witches was common in Europe at this time, and witches were blamed for any major outbreak or problem. The Jews very much the same way, and the Jews were also a huge target because they did not accept Christ as their Messiah. And that fear of witches, and even in Jews, came to the United States, and that's where you get the Salem witch trials of 1692. But by the 1700s, especially with the rise of the Enlightenment, persecution of witches died out, and it is something that in history that's really fascinating, but a little bit overblown in my opinion. AI Shadow, did you enjoy the 2024 movie Reagan? Yes, I did. I thought it was very good. I thought it did definitely paint a very proactive picture of Reagan as a hero. It did not talk about the AIDS crisis where Reagan really screwed up. And if you want to learn more about that, watch my long form video on Reagan, and also my video where I talk about one good and bad thing for each president that I did as a President's Day special a couple weeks ago. Reagan had a lot of great qualities and did a lot of really cool things when he was president. He had mistakes and problems, and the Reagan movie kind of touches on it, but could have done a better job with that. But I think the most beautiful part of that movie was how they handled him dealing with Alzheimer's at the very end. It was very moving. It was very passionate. It was very inspiring. Great to see you. Welcome back. Yep, put that in the vault. Well, that's what we're here for, learning about history, gaining new knowledge, perspectives, and ideas, and then using it later down the line. I'm happy to see physical media making a comeback, especially in Canada, where still not everyone can afford internet. Yes, Ryan. I feel like VHSs, DVDs, and cable TV will all be things that are like vinyl players, where they become retro and it becomes really niche and cool to like them, and there's a market for them in the next 10 to 20 years. Yeah, well, I would say, what I was saying, so in looking back, Hoover would have been a good president anytime before. Yeah, I think Herbert Hoover would have been a good president if he had just not been president during the Great Depression. Yeah. Yeah, the Reagan movie's good. It's not, if you don't like Reagan, you're not going to like it as much as someone who would like Reagan, but it's not horribly, overwhelmingly biased where it's like, oh, come on, you're just showering with praise. No, it tells the story of this really interesting guy from a very unique perspective. And I don't think that anyone, left or right, really can say that Ronald Reagan wasn't influential. He was extremely influential. Anyways, we are at 6 o'clock. We've gone almost an hour. I'm going to wrap it up now. Be sure to follow me on those social medias that are at the top that M put in the chat, and all of that great stuff. Oh yeah, and Ryan, you can always learn history when you watch a movie about a president. So even if you don't like the president, or even if you love him, you can learn a lot of history. Same thing with learning about a Canadian prime minister like Mr. Trudeau. Left or right movement, what is closer to your heart? I don't share my political perspectives. I have an entire series where I cover the 2024 presidential election because I knew it would be a historical one. And so I was very objective in my coverage there, and I try to be as objective as I possibly can. And I've had people call me a left-wing nut job and a right-wing conspiracy theorist. So I get all of it all the time, and I really enjoy that because it means I'm doing something right. And yes, everybody feel free to come back tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we will be doing another hour of this Q&A and all of that. And thank you, everybody, for a really great live stream. I will, after you're done here, and thank you, Angel, that's so sweet of you. Check out my long form video on Black History Month. It just dropped, and I've got daily content, who was born today, who died today, and what happened on history this day, and I've got 5 and 15, I've got historical myths, did you know? There's a bunch of different history that we bring to you here at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, and whenever I'm feeling just the spirit to just make a video about a topic, I just take out my phone and do it, so it's a lot of fun. Is there a history where we didn't learn history and repeated the same thing again? There are many examples of that. Let me see. Appeasement is obviously one of them. Well, bring back your question tomorrow. Let me think of a specific incident, and I will be sure to answer, because there's a lot of incidents like that in history where people did not learn their history. I think the Russian czars refusing to free the serfs and provide political representation would come back to haunt them, because one czar after another refused to do it, and it eventually destroyed the Romanov dynasty. So that's one example, but there's plenty more, and it's almost like on a country-by-country basis. Thomas, what can you tell us about the United Fruit Company? Not too much. I've heard of them before. You'd have to jog my memory. We're wrapping up right now, but let's talk about that tomorrow. I'm going to have to do some research into it. But yeah, well, hopefully that one's a good example to you, the Russian Empire and their refusal to free their serfs, which were basically people who were forced to work a particular plot of land for their noblemen. So yeah, I hope you all have a really fun and safe Friday evening and a great Saturday, and I will see you or either, depending on wherever you are, tomorrow night, tomorrow afternoon, and we'll have another hour of Q&A. Ask me anything about history. Take care, have a great night, and remember, love history. Bye-bye now.